Omrin had recognised the screams of his wife from a quarter of a mile away. He'd run and he'd run and he'd run to try and get to the source of those sounds, going between the trees, understanding that in the woods sound often bounces in different directions, and where you think it's coming from is not always where it is coming from. But he searched and he searched, and it was within a matter of minutes that he came within sight of his wife. There she was, sprawled in the snow, there a man atop her, attacking her. And he ran, screaming and shouting and crying out. And the man looked up and saw the figure coming towards him and backed away, ran off into the distance. At Omrin's side, his husky, his snow dog, Ahmal, barked and barked and ran the faster, of course, because the dog was that much more agile than the man, pursuing the fleeing figure. Omrin, his more immediate concern, his wife, who was lying still prone in the snow, ran and ran as fast as he could to get there. But when he arrived, she was within seconds of death. The blood flowed from her body. It was obvious that she had been assaulted, attacked in the worst possible of ways, and that her attacker had not only taken what he wanted, but robbed from her her very life. And Omrin sat in the snow, cradling his wife's head in his lap, weeping tears down his face, and said, "Who did this? Who did this?" And even before his wife croaked the name of Andre, he knew who it must be. The man who had pestered and annoyed his wife for years before she had married Omrin, and continued to pester and annoy her for years afterwards, despite the number of occasions when Omrin had made his feelings known, when his wife Gidingev's brothers had made their feelings known to this nuisance of a man, this Andre, who had turned his back on the Chachki ways, to the point where he'd given up his own original name and embraced the Russian name of Andrei, and embraced the Russian ways and the Russian habits and the Russian language, holding his own people and their traditions in contempt. And now he had crossed the final line. And realizing his wife had slipped away, had gone to the great world beyond, Omrin, swearing vengeance, swearing justice, stood and staggered, following not only the boot prints of Andre fleeing, but the paw prints of his dog Ahmal. Through the woods he went, on and on and on, his heart heavy with grief, tears freezing upon his face in the cold air, running and running and running, until up ahead he heard a yell, a cry, a human cry, and then the high-pitched yelp of a dog. He heard the crack of a bullet and another, and his heart thudding. All the faster he ran and he ran, until he came within sight. There in the snow lay the prone form of his beloved dog, the dog he had nurtured and reared from puppyhood. The dog who had been by his side almost as long as his wife had been by his side. And there Andre, standing over the dog, a knife in one hand and a gun in the other. Andre cried out to him to back off, to stay away. But on Omrin went, drawing his own knife, wanting vengeance, wanting justice for his wife, for his dog, who lay there in a spreading pool of blood in the snow. He drew his knife, he prepared to throw it, and in the instant he threw the knife, Andre fired the gun, and Omrin felt the bullet pierce him, knocking him back in the snow. And as he lay there staring up at the clouds, feeling the numbness and the pain spreading through his body, feeling the dampness and the warmth of the blood gushing from the wound, he looked across and he saw that Andre too was lying prone in the snow. And he could but assume that his knife had been as true as Andre's bullet had been true. And it was not the end he wanted. His wife dead, his dog dead, himself moments from death. But there was justice of a form in the death of Andre, that he had paid for his crimes, and would commit no more. Omrin looked at the sky. He wanted to look at his dog, but the angle at which the body of the dog lay, he couldn't quite reach it, and he no longer had the strength to move himself, to turn and see where Ahmal lay in the snow. He instead watched the clouds pass, watched a few flakes of snow fall down, and the world grew darker and darker and darker. And then it grew lighter and lighter and lighter. And Omrim found that the pain was not as bad as it had been. And looking, he saw, in fact, he could see no blood. He saw nothing. He searched himself. The bullet hole was not where it had been. And he had enough energy, enough drive to pull himself to his feet. And the snows were not blood-stained as they had been. And there was Ahmal also getting to his paws, getting to his feet, shaking the snow from his body, tongue lolling, tail wagging. And there was Andre also getting to his feet. And there was no blood in the snow around the dog, and there was no blood in the snow around Andre. And Omrin began to think, was this a dream? Was he waking from a dream? Had he simply fallen asleep in the snow and dreamt the whole incident with the fight and the shooting and the stabbing and the death of his beloved wife? He hoped it was a dream, a terrible nightmare. He hoped that's all it was. But the trees seemed different, not the trees he was familiar with, a type of tree he had never seen before, he didn't recognize. And there was a river not so far off, a couple of 100 yards off. And there was no river there before. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He'd lived within them the entirety of his 35 years, and he had never seen a river there. And he realized that wherever he was, it wasn't somewhere he was familiar with at all. He staggered towards the dog. The dog rushed towards him, tongue lolling, tail wagging, sniffing and yipping and rubbing and nuzzling itself up against him. He hugged the dog, he petted it, he embraced Ahmal with all the warmth of a long-lost friend, a long-lost brother. And Andre stood there, off in the snow, looking confused and as bewildered as Omrin himself thought. And in one instant, Omrin wanted to go to him and plunge his dagger into him, and in the other he thought, well, if I have dreamt the whole thing, if I have imagined the whole thing, if this was a nightmare, then I would be stabbing a man guilty of no crime at all. And so the rational part of Omrin stayed the hand of the vengeful, passionate part of Omrin. And he staggered towards Andre, not knowing whether to hold out a hand in friendship or punch the bugger in the face or what to do. And Andre was patting his own body as if searching for a wound, the way Omrin had been searching for the bullet wound earlier. At last the two looked at each other and said, where are we? Where is this place? What has happened? And Omrin, who had never much liked Andre, because I had this terrible nightmare. You were chasing me, and well, I was chasing you, and you had done to my wife. And from the look of guilt upon Andre's face, Omrin in that instant knew that if he had had a nightmare, then Andre had had the identical nightmare, but from the other point of view. And then, in the second that followed that thought, Omrin began to realize what had happened and where they were. And from the look that passed over Andre's face, perhaps he too was having the same thought in that same second. And they looked, the two of them, to the river, because they had heard the tales from their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their great-grandfathers, their great-grandmothers. They'd heard those tales, and whilst Andrei held them in nothing but contempt, Omrin believed them wholeheartedly. And there was the river of which they had been told so many times. And Omrin was the first to move towards the river, the dog rushing ahead of him. It was a river no different from any other river to look upon. But Omrin knew the tales, that the river they had to cross, the first of 7 rivers that they would need to cross in the underworld, in the land of the dead, was the river of tears. The tears wept by the mourning and the grieving, those whose hearts had been broken through the loss of their loved ones. Every tear that streamed down their face eventually made its way to the river of tears. And if it is the river of tears, as everyone says, tears are salty. And so Omrin took off his deer skin glove and stretched a hand tentatively into the waters. And they felt as ordinary as any other water might do. And he tasted it, and it was salty. This was not a sweet water river. This was a saltwater river, and there were no saltwater rivers where he lived. Except, of course, he lived no longer. And he stood and he turned to Andrei and he said, "This is the river of tears. We are dead. You have killed me and I have killed you. And you have killed my dog as you killed my wife." And at the thought of that, where was she? But they had run quite some distance through the wood, chasing one another, and her body was way off. So perhaps she, having died the first, she had already awakened. She had already wandered off, followed the path that must be followed. And Omrin began to wonder what path must be followed, and he looked around somewhat confused. And Achmal barked and barked and looked and barked and looked and did his best lassie impersonation. And across the river, on the other bank, Omrin could see a path winding its way up through the grasses, up through the hills, and the snows were thinner and thinner and thinner upon the other side of the bank, such that a couple of 100 yards off he could see the grass poking through where there was so little snow, the grass beneath it could be seen, and further away was completely green. The snows were on this side of the bank. The other side was getting warmer and warmer and warmer. But it was a deep river, a wide river, and look as they might in either direction, they could see no bridge with which to cross. "What are we to do?" Omrin asked aloud. Andrei had no answers. The dog barked again. Omrin looked at the dog looked at Omrin, and the dog plunged headlong into the river. A strong swimmer, this, for snow dogs are. He splashed around, happy as a puppy rolling in the snows, except here splashing in the waters, and waited, looked up at his master with happy, joyful eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to convey a message. And whilst the dog did not speak, this not being a Disney movie, he did not speak, but Omrin, whether by telepathy or intuition, or call it what you will, somehow knew what the dog wanted. The dog wanted him to get into the river too, and hold on around the dog's waist. And Omrin stripped off his big heavy reindeer clothes, seeing that the other side of the bank was so warm that he wouldn't need those clothes on that side of the bank. He stripped them off down to his undergarments and left his clothes in a pile, waded into that rather cold and salty river that splashed into his mouth as he got in deeper, and the saltiness of it was disgusting. The tears of the grieving were so heavy, so numerous, so many, that he wished there would be no more added to it, but he knew that when his his brothers and his sisters and his mother and his old grandfather found his corpse and his wife's corpse and the dog's corpse, there would be much grieving for them. And even Andre had some people who liked him in the village who would grieve for the loss of him. And this river would but get deeper and heavier. But as he put his arm around the dog's waist, the dog began to doggy paddle across with great strength, far more vigour than seemed reasonably possible for one husky. But he pulled and he pulled, and Omrin, who had never been much of a swimmer in his life, where he lived there was hardly any cause to go swimming anywhere, was pulled safely across the great river to the other side, and the two of them clambered up onto the far bank, the dog shaking himself as dogs will, and tears flying left and right, hither and yon, and Omrin trying to dry himself off as best he can, and we humans are never particularly well suited to that one. They stood upon the bank gasping and spluttering. Andre on the far bank called across, "How am I to get across? How am I to get across? Send your dog back for me." The dog turned to him and growled and snarled and let forth with a volley of woofing and barking and woo-wooing as huskies will, with such vigour, such contempt, that had he let rip with a stream of swear words, it could not have been more explicit. And the dog turned his tail and walked along the path that went through the last remains of the snow and into the grassy meadows. And Omrin turned and looked at Andre and shrugged his shoulders and followed the dog. Well, they had not got a couple of yards when they heard coughing and spluttering and yelling and swearing, and looking back, man and dog saw Andre struggling to swim across the bank. He too had left his heavy clothes behind and was almost naked, but trying to swim across the river as best he could, and struggling and going under and coming up again and cracking down and going up. Somehow, Andre got to the other side of the bank, but it was a miracle he had not drowned, and when he pulled himself up onto the bank, he looked half dead. And there was some conditioned scrap of humanity, some compassion within Omrin's heart, even for this monster who had raped and murdered his wife, who had killed his dog, who had killed him, that he almost went to help the bedraggled man. And then the rage boiled within him, and he thought, "Sort yourself out." And the dog was woofing and calling to his master to hurry up and follow. And so Omrin turned his back on Andre and followed the dog. On and on they went for what may have been a mile or two. It was hard to tell, for distance seemed very different in the underworld. And every now and then he would cast a look back over his shoulder and see the distant figure of Andre struggling to keep up, trudging on alone and alone. They came to the banks of another river. This, from the smell of it, from hundreds of yards away, Omrin, and Andre for that matter, could smell the river. And the closer each of the two men got, though they were apart from one another, they could see the boiling, churning, bubbling, well, we cannot call them waters, for they were scarlet with great clots of black within them. And they got close enough, the two of them, apart from one another, but close enough that each could see, and undoubtedly the dog knew ahead, for the smell of the nose of a dog is so much greater than the nose of a human, that this was the famed river of blood, of which their grandparents and great-grandparents back to the year dot had told. The second of the 7 rivers that had to be crossed. And the path wound along the banks of the river for some time, so that they had to walk alongside the river, seeing this vast quantity of churning blood flowing down the river, some of it clotting into great chunks, and in and amongst the blood there were things bobbing to the top of the river every now and then that could have been livers and lungs and kidneys and other organs. And the ancient ones tell that just as the salt water river are all the bitter tears of grief wept by the morning, so this river of blood and guts and organs is a river shed by murderers, by suicides, by those who die horribly and violently in battle. It is all the carnage of humanity, whether inflicted upon each other or upon oneself, that gushes and gushes and gushes in a great river. And just as there is no likelihood of wars ending, of murderers stopping murdering, of suicides stopping committing suicide, so there is no likelihood that the river of blood will ever run dry. And Omrin thought within his heart, oh, how on earth are we going to get across this? Will we have to swim across? Will I have to hold on to my dear old dog as he brings us across this vile and terrible river? And then he remembered the stories of his grandmother, that somewhere across the great river of blood is a bridge. And that is where the path alongside the river, after they had had their fill of nose and eyes and ears of the horrible sounds and smells and sights of the river, eventually that path led them to a bridge which they could see in the distance, and they got closer and closer, and they saw this enormously long bridge stretching across the enormously wide river of blood, for there is far more blood shed than there are tears wept in grief. And when they finally arrived, man and dog and Andre catching up at the rear, they arrived at the beginning of the bridge. It seemed a narrow sort of a bridge, with only very low parapets either side. A dangerous kind of bridge to cross. But the husky Ahmal skipped, if dogs can be said to skip, across the bridge with great joy and great confidence, rushing ahead, woofing and yipping with excitement, as if he could smell something wonderful on the far side of the bridge instead of the wretched stench of this river of blood. Omrin followed across, and behind him, just a distance away, followed Andre. The bridge seemed to stretch on for forever. It went on, and it went on, and it went on, and every now and then the two men would glance down into the river and see the churning, boiling blood, and what they would never see would be struts supporting the bridge. And each of them wondered how on earth the bridge stayed up, but then they were in the underworld, and perhaps the laws of physics are different in the underworld, who knows, the way things work in the land beyond, the land beneath the world. The woofing and the yipping stopped. Omrin's mind was far away, Andre's mind was far away, and it was only suddenly when he felt the presence of his dog that Omrin stopped, and he realised that long narrow bridge had bifurcated. There was a path, half the bridge going to the left and half the bridge going to the right. The strangest bridge either of them had ever seen in their lives. And he stood there looking down at his dog, who was sitting at the junction of this Y-shaped split in the bridge. Tongue lolling, tail wagging, look at him with the brightest blue eyes and a smile upon his face. And again, the dog did not speak as such, but Omrin knew, could sense, could intuit, could read the expression of his dog more clearly now than ever he had been able to in life. And he knelt down in front of Ahmal and embraced him and hugged him. And the dog rubbed himself up and down against his master and poured out his love in the way that only dogs do. And they spent so long embracing and hugging that Andre caught up with them And suddenly Omrin realised that Andre was stood a couple of inches behind his shoulder. And Omrin himself stood up and turned to Andre and said, "You may have forgotten the old tales, turned your back upon them, but we were told about the River of Tears, and there is a River of Tears. We were told about the River of Blood, and here is the River of Blood. We were told about the split in the bridge, and here is the split in the bridge. All the tales we have been told are true, and if you have forgotten, I shall remind you. To the left, that path goes down across the river to where the land of dogs resides, and that is where Akmal will be going. He will be leaving us soon into the land of dogs, where the happy and joyful dogs of the world go to reside. And upon the right-hand path, there is the land of humans, the land of our kind. The dead dogs and the dead humans. We must go. But, Akmal, like all dogs, takes his time, his service, his duty, to guard the junction of the bridge. Those who have been good and kind and gentle to dogs may pass to the right. Those who have been wicked and brutal to dogs. And here he did not even need to finish the message. For before he could say so much as another word, Akmal's lips peeled back and revealed that enormous set of bright white fangs. He snarled, he growled, he leapt up at Andre, taking a lump out of him and pushing the man back over the bridge. He toppled down and down, screaming and howling into the river of blood, and was seen no more. And Akmal, his duty done, licked his master once more, before turning tail and scurrying down the left-hand path, rushing off, and there in the distance Omrin could hear the happy barking of other dogs calling out in greeting to Akmal, "Welcome, brother, welcome, welcome, welcome." And he stood and he watched, tears dripping down his face, but not the salty tears of grief, the sweet tears of joy, to see the happiness of his dog, to know that he would one day see Akmal again, for they could visit, but for now, Akmal had his own things to do. And when he could see Akmal no more, when he had disappeared off beyond sight, Omrin turned to the right-hand path and walked the few minutes to get to the other bank, which from the split he hadn't even been able to see, such is the nature of the afterlife. And there he arrived and saw a great village, an enormous village. Beyond the word village doesn't even begin to describe it. And he saw his old uncle, who had passed 5 years earlier. He saw a small child who he realised was the child his wife had lost in pregnancy several years earlier. He saw other people, friends, family, neighbours, people who had passed over in the years of his own life, and before and before and before, and they came out to greet him. And there was his wife. There was Gittingev, who came out to greet him. And he rushed up to her and he hugged her, and the tears, the sweet tears of joy, flowed down his face as they flowed down hers. And just as there is a river of bitter, salty tears, so one of the 7 rivers is the river of sweet tears, of sweet water, of sweet happiness and sweet joy. Unfortunate to say, it is not as big as the river of bitter tears, but it is there. And the two of them stood apart from each other, holding hands, looking into each other's eyes, until there was a voice at their shoulder. And there Umrin recognised the face of his own father, who had died many years earlier. And the old man hugged him and held him and said, "There is time yet, time yet. The bridge has not yet closed. There is time yet for one of you to go back. Who shall it be? Who shall it be?" And one of them did go back after more weeping of sweet tears. And one of them did awake in the snow to discover that the wound upon their body was not as deep as it might have been, and that the blood they had lost was not enough to carry them over entirely. And that one went on to live a long life, to overcome their loss and their grief and begin again, until eventually their time came when they rejoined the one who stayed. But as to which one stayed and which one went, that I leave to your imagination.